Feel like we need like tour short shirts for you. You're on tour this week.
No, busy.
Maybe we'll have them ready for the house budget.
Perfect.
Good morning as folks are joining us for the update on the fiscal 26 governor's proposal. We'll give folks a minute to join. Maybe a little weather forecast about what you're seeing out your window now.
A pretty snow, but I'm not
Yeah,
outside.
same. It's light. I'm in the office, lightly snowing. And schools are intermittently canceled. Like I heard Brookline's closed, but Boston's not.
Yes. My husband's a high school teacher in Walpole, and they're in. So,
I didn't know that, Victoria.
yeah.
Oh, snow day there in Providence. All right, snowing in Springfield. We could be of service to so many different sectors of our statewide 413-508-978 presence. Snow day in Worcester. Wow, lots of capital letters there, Belmar. Arlington too. Wow. Okay. I am going to the Celtics game tonight. So they're playing the Dallas Mavericks. So it's a matchup of the finals last year without Luca. So I'll give you the update next week. Great to see folks joining. Welcome. Lots of snow in Cape Cod. Snow sticking to the ground. Curious about the children on buses in Boston this afternoon. Indeed. You never know. It's a tough job figuring out whether you should call it or not. All right, Victoria, we'll turn things over to you. And while we know you are a regular here on the 9:30 call, it's still always fun to hear kind of how you got to be in your current role. So maybe just give us the short version of that, and we look forward to hearing the update.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here today. It's my first time presenting on the 9:30 call, so very excited. It is, I
Oh my
know.
gosh, welcome. Then tell us your whole story.
Yes. I am a policy researcher for the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. We do a lot of work on the state budget and specific policy areas like healthcare, transportation, and I am the dedicated researcher for early education and care. And I've been here for a little over a year now. Before that, I was on the government relations team for the Massachusetts Teachers Association, one of our state teachers unions. So learned a lot about the legislative process there and did some more K-12 higher ed work. But it's been a great year, and I'm excited to share more about the governor's budget proposals today.
Thanks so much, Victoria. And just saw Ashley White pop up, who was our previous
Yes,
guru of early ed at Mass Taxpayers Foundation. So again, it's great to see the comings and goings of folks here on the 9:30 call. And welcome. I can't believe this is your first time.
I know,
Seems
I know.
impossible. All right.
All right, I will share my screen if I can.
And oh, wait a minute, I probably didn't do it. As a reminder, we're working with neighborhood villages on a kind of post event once you kind of hear Victoria's presentation. So we'll put that information in chat to register. And that's really about kind of we're encouraging folks to come to the 9:30 call today. Victoria had over 100 people at the briefing earlier this week. So we'll just encourage folks to watch this presentation and then come to ours next week. And so, Victoria, we can see your notes too. So if you want to
Okay,
do the
let's
pledge,
display. That right?
I think, who knows? Yes, it works.
Okay. Do we still see notes?
Nope, you
Okay,
see, yep.
perfect. Okay, so thank you again, everybody. I'm going to be going through kind of a budget process 101 to start us off, ground us where we are in the budget process, give a little bit of an overview of the fiscal context that we are operating in, and also kind of big picture highlights of the governor's budget overall, and then we'll dig into the early ed proposals. All right, so wanted to start off with kind of a glossary of terms that might be helpful for folks to see through as you hear through the budget process, starting with fiscal year, we are currently in fiscal year 2025 and discussing the budget for fiscal year 2026, which will start July 1st, 2025 and end June 30th, 2026. The governor's budget for FY 2026 is also known as House 1. That's kind of the bill number that is assigned to the governor's budget in the first year of a legislative session. So her FY 2027 budget will be House 2 because she'll file it in the second year of the 2025-2026 session. A lot of numbers, but House 1 is the governor's budget. Line items and earmarks, that's where we see specific funding proposals for programs, departments, and services. I'll show an example on the next slide of what an earmark in a line item looks like. Appropriation is the specific funding amount we talk about for a program. The GAA, also known as the General Appropriations Act, is what we call the final budget once it's signed into law. So if you hear me say FY 2025 GAA, that's the final FY 2025 budget. And then finally, outside section are pieces of the budget where policy is able to be passed through the budget, which might not be related to a specific funding proposal. It could be. But for instance, last year we saw a lot of early ed policy get passed through the state budget, including the codification of C3, which is just another way for lawmakers to pass policy outside of the legislative process of filing a bill. And Amy, feel free to jump in if people have questions.
No, that's really helpful. So far, no questions.
Great. Okay, so just an example line item on the screen here. You can see the line item number is the number that you'll see to the left of any language in the budget. So that's helpful if you're trying to search for a specific program to find their line item number. Underlined in the line item language is an example earmark. So anytime you kind of see provided for, provided that, with a specific funding amount within the line item, that's just telling you out of the overall appropriation for this line item, which is that $28 million there, 100,000 of which is in the earmark to be allocated for this intern pipeline program. So one example we saw last year were earmarks to fund the educator loan forgiveness program and early educator scholarship program. So those didn't have their own line items, but they were earmarks within another line item.
So helpful, Victoria. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so timeline, we have the legislature and the governor agreed on a consensus revenue number, which is essentially they agree on how much revenue they'll have available to spend in the operating budget. Then the governor released her budget on January 22nd. And so now the House and Senate are both looking through the governor's proposal and crafting their own budgets. I'll go through a couple of the key pieces next. So pretty soon we'll start to see what are called Joint Ways and Means Committee hearings being scheduled. The Joint Committee, the House and Senate committees on Ways and Means host these public hearings on different policy areas before the House releases their Ways and Means budget. And we'll see the commissioner present at the education related one. I think, Amy, did you present last year too? Okay, so yeah, so different stakeholders, advocates are also invited to present at those hearings that take place across the state on different policy areas. And people are also welcome to submit written testimony as well. Okay, so then after the public hearings, the House will release their Ways and Means budget first, usually in the second week of April. And then they go into debate, and then the Senate releases their Ways and Means proposal in May, and then they go into debate. But typically, we'll kind of see the Ways and Means budgets get released, and then representatives and senators have 3 days to read through the budget and propose amendments that are then debated on. Some things that we look for in the Ways and Means budgets are more specific policy language, maybe in outside sections or within line items as well to talk about more reporting requirements or
For a surgery date.
Oh, that's
program
great.
specific program specific language that the House and Senate might want to see. The governor's budget is usually much less detailed in those areas because the administration administers the program. So there's often less language there. Um, so then we'll get into debate, and you can see in the chart the number of amendments that representatives and senators submitted in the past fiscal years. And there are several days of debate, and they kind of usually group by topic area again as they're going through, or by secretariat as they're going through the budget. After each branch debates their Ways and Means budgets, they pass a final House and a final Senate budget, and then a conference committee is created, made up of 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate. And they basically have to go line by line and reconcile any differences, make compromises on certain things, whether it's a comma in a line item or a larger outside policy section. So that is definitely an area where we'll be watching closely. It is usually it's a confidential process. So we, always encourage folks to advocate for if you have a preference between a House and Senate proposal, but it's sometimes hard to know which way they're leaning as they're going through that process. And usually the goal is to have the final budget enacted by July 1st. We were a little late, and we usually are a little late. So that's something to know as well. Is July 1st is the technical deadline, but it won't be surprising if we go a little bit later than that before the final budget is enacted. And also, once the conference report is finalized, that is sent to the governor, and she can send back vetoes to spending or language. And the legislature can override those vetoes as well, but they need a 2/3 vote in both chambers to override vetoes. So last year we saw the House override some of the governor's vetoes, but the Senate did not act on them. So those vetoes stood in the final GAA. All right.
And Victoria,
Yep.
as you continue on, there's a couple of questions for later. How do we feel about earmarks? Is the legislature frowning on those? How much of the state budget will be impacted by I added potential Brenda government freezes?
Mhm.
How much of the EEC money is contributed by the feds?
Yep. Great. Yes, I have a slide on
Right,
federal
Victoria heard the
investment.
feedback and added a slide from
So
the
no, I
feds.
appreciate it. And yes, we'll get into that in a little
Perfect.
bit.
Thanks.
Earmarks are very, very normal. And a lot of times they are due to local advocacy requests.
And I think sometimes here earmarks as like legislators' pet projects, but
Sure.
sometimes earmarks are also because like the examples that you're using, there's a bigger line item and it's just
Mhm.
a carve out for something. So
Yes,
I think
exactly.
there's different
So
perceptions of earmarks.
So yeah, another example from last year was the line item for $18 million to help expand CCFA. And there was an earmark in there specifically for early educators
Right.
to receive CCFA for their own childcare. So that's another example. All right, I'll go through these pretty quickly, and at the end I'll put a link to our larger presentation recording because my colleague Megan Callahan goes through kind of more information on the fiscal context here. But this slide just gives you an idea of during the pandemic, we were seeing a lot higher than expected revenue come into the state. A
Wow.
lot of that, yeah, a lot of that to do with the stock market, capital gains revenue. And we've seen in the past couple years this kind of return to where we would have expected to be before the pandemic if usual growth had occurred. So, and we can see that the higher revenue in 21, 22, 23 contributed to larger spending growth in the budget as well, especially the FY 2023 budget saw a 9.1% spending growth. And something that we've been talking about and that you can see, especially reflected in the 2025 budget, is kind of a return to lower spending levels to make sure that we don't outpace the revenue that we're collecting now as it's gone back down to normal. And also on the fair share income surtax, as you might have heard, on the same day that the governor filed her FY 2026 operating budget, she also filed a fair share supplemental budget, which allocated surplus above cap surplus surtax collections from the past two fiscal years. And this chart kind of gives you an idea of how that money has flowed from FY 2024. So moving from the left to the right, in FY 2024, the governor and the legislature set a $1 billion cap for the amount of surtax to be used in the 2024 operating budget. But we saw collections come in for the surtax at $2.46 billion. So what happens to that yellow bar at the top that is not spent in the FY 2024 budget? Got allocated in three ways. So in a closeout budget at the end of last year for FY 2024, they deposited $150 million from that surplus into the operational grant trust fund to support C3. And we saw them do that because that grant fund was created in FY 2025 to collect revenue from a new online lottery system to support C3, but it's not being implemented yet. There's a delay, just as implementation of programs happens. So that $150 million deposit from the top of the surplus surtax was put in the operational grant trust fund so that there was enough funds to support C3 this year and next. After that, then the remaining above cap collections get deposited between two funds, the Surtax Reserve Fund, which is essentially a stabilization fund for fair share, which received $197 million from the FY 2024 collections, and then Education and Transportation Innovation and Capital Fund, which receives 85% of above cap collections. So in FY 2024, about $1.1 billion was deposited into that fund. So the supplemental budget that the governor filed is allocating the funds in the innovation and capital account. And combined with collections that also came in FY 2023, that's about $1.3 billion that the supplemental budget is allocating. And I'll dig into that a little bit later.
And there was a question about the cap. And so
Yeah.
I'm going to try to answer that, and then I will go to you for the kind of confirmation. Basically, it was a new thing, a new stream of revenue. So they said we're going to expect $1 billion, right?
They say we're going to expect more, but we don't want to count on more.
Right. So, but we're going to budget for one.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so that was the cap. They kind of capped what they were going to spend out of that potential revenue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then they said, okay, we got that, and then we got this much more.
Yes.
Right. So it's basically like if you were doing your own budget and you had like a new revenue stream coming in, you would maybe bank on X amount of dollars that you could spend out. But then when you get more, what Victoria just explained, now you have to figure out how you're going to allocate the extra money that came in.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And so they set a spending cap for the surtax each year that it's been implemented. In FY 2024, it was $1 billion. For FY 2025, they saw, we're collecting more than we expected, so we're going to raise the cap to 1.3 billion. And now for FY 2026, the cap that they set is 1.95 billion.
So just like you, they learn like, okay, it's trending this way, right? And so, okay, that's really helpful. Thanks, Victoria.
Absolutely. Federal funds. I'll spend a little bit of time on this. So overall, the state budget generally about 25% of it comes from federal grants and reimbursements. A huge chunk of that is to do with mass health reimbursements from Medicaid. So that the pie chart there shows you the breakdown for FY 2025. 19% of the state budget comes from that mass health reimbursement. So that's something that we're watching very
carefully.
closely. in the context of education and early education, there are also other federal grants that come in separate from the Medicaid ones, and two which would relate to early ed. So there's the Child Care Development Block Grant, which in FY 2024 brought in $184.6 million. And those funds are to support CCFA and child care subsidies. Um, there is also a TANF block grant, and a portion of that is also allocated to the Child Care Development Block Grant to support childcare. So in FY 2024, that was $91.6 million from the TANF block grant. I'm going to talk, I have a slide on Head Start a little bit later,
Great.
but those federal funds work differently. They don't go into the state budget. They get distributed directly to Head Start providers.
Right.
So the Head Start funding is not included in this
Right.
chart here. All right, I'll go through these quickly so we can get to the main highlights. But
And as a reminder, Victoria did an hour presentation, so you can
yeah.
always go and watch that.
Yeah, and we'll share these slides as well.
Thank you.
But mainly just highlighting the overall budget increases spending compared to the FY 2025 GAA by 7.4%. But when we take into account the estimated spending that the administration is expecting for FY 2025, that's a more modest increase of 2.1%. And we got a question on Tuesday about the difference there, and it's usually like totally normal for spending to exceed what is originally budgeted, which is why we often see like mid-year supplemental budgets and a closeout supplemental budget to kind of catch up to where things actually fall. We already talked about the spending cap. It's set for FY 2026 for the fair share funds at $1.95 billion. And you can see right next to it, they're still expecting collections for fair share to exceed or be around $2.4 billion. So we'll keep kind of probably seeing these surplus surtax supplemental budgets in the next couple of years as collections are above the cap set by the consensus revenue process. And again, just a big picture of where spending occurs in the state budget, most in healthcare, in mass health. And then we also see education, support services, transportation as the next three largest areas of spending, especially due to the surtax for education and transportation. Wow. All right. 5 minutes.
And there was a question about the 1.1 billion innovate that going toward vouchers. And unfortunately, Sandy, it's not that easy because when you fund a voucher, you have to have the money for as long as that child may need the voucher. So
yes.
but we can talk more about that.
Yeah. So definitely there's an annualization of funds that are put into a budget every year. I'm gonna skip ahead and go through. This chart shows just kind of the historic increases that EEC has seen since the pandemic. And here we have kind of a breakdown of how the governor is proposing to use the surtax and other trust funds to support early ed, mostly C3, but we also see CCFA being supported by fair share. So how is the supplemental budget relating to early ed investments? Of the $1.3 billion that is allocated in the supplemental budget, $150 million is proposed for early education. $50 million to support CPPI expansion to other gateway cities, and $100 million for kind of a broad category of initiatives to support workforce affordability and quality improvements. It's also our understanding that these funds proposed in the supplemental budget will be available for multiple years. So they wouldn't all have to be spent in FY 2025. So C3 is level funded again at $475 million. And the governor uses $85 million from the general fund, $115 million from the Operational Grant Trust Fund, which is the fund that saw that 150 million deposit, and then $275 million from the surtax to support C3. There aren't any new reporting requirements or things for the program, in the governor's budget, but that is something we could see in the House and Senate budgets. As I said, they tend to add more prescriptive language for
Right.
programs. So CCFA, I know we got a lot of questions about this funding distribution and the impacts on Tuesday. So spend a little more time here. Um, Overall, funding to support CCFA is totaled at about $1.1 billion. And the breakdown of that is the base funding for the DCF, DTA programs at $448.2 million, and the base funding for income eligible at $517.6 million. And then the governor also proposes an additional $98 million from the income surtax to support maintaining CCFA capacity and rate increases. So again, that's the annualization of those rate increases that we've passed in the past few years. So what does that kind of big $1.1 billion number mean? For that, we wanted to kind of share some more information about the difference between the budgets that are passed and then the estimated spending for programs. And you'll see in orange on the chart here, estimated spending for the DCF DTA and especially the income eligible programs are expected to come in higher than appropriated amounts for 2025. So it seems that the governor's budget for FY 2026 takes that into account and is proposing funding levels more in line with the actual cost of the program as opposed to what was passed in last year's budget. Now, as everyone on here I'm sure knows and has seen, CCFA is serving more kids than it ever has, about 10,000 more than 10,000 more than before the pandemic. And that comes with increased costs, as well as the rate reforms that have been put in place to bring rates closer to the cost of care. And so we've seen kind of a shift for the governor proposing this additional spending to make sure we maintain that capacity and those rate levels. So unfortunately, in the governor's budget, there's not additional funding for new rate increases, just funding so that the rate increases that have been put into place will be maintained. And at these funding levels also, it's not expected that access will be able to expand greatly. And so that's something to think about as well in the context of the budget. And wrapping up, CPPI again receives support from the surtax. And just want to talk about Head Start. I don't know if Michelle's on the call, but encouraging people to go to the Massachusetts Head Start Association for more information there. But this slide kind of gives you an idea of the funding that comes in for programs directly from the federal government. The state allocates supplemental grants, but they're a smaller chunk of the Head Start funding. Sorry, I know we're at
Go
time.
ahead.
Wrapping up, again, we are in the period between the governor's budget and when the House Ways and Means budget gets released. So a great time for advocacy, a great time to share your priorities and concerns with the House and Senate committees on Ways and Means and your local legislators.
There was a question about TANF. And so can you say a word about like what that means, like what that money going into CCFA?
Sure. So that's something I'm still learning about more too, as we kind of take a closer look at what that means in the context of the new presidential administration. But so as I understand it, there's federal funds that go to support TANF.
Right.
A percentage of that also goes to support childcare.
And states can decide how much of their TANF dollars I think they can spend on childcare. So it's to support families who are receiving TFTC.
Mhm, mhm.
So it's so that's that. We'll make sure that that's correct, Victoria, that I described that correctly when we have our event. And then remember, this is just the first step in the budget process. And so the House does their budget, as Victoria said, the Senate does their budget. And then there's a question about if there's any worry about if the revenues from fair share will go down. And I would say yes, that's why I think they've been so conservative about how they're putting how much they're counting on each year.
Sure. Yeah, that's always a worry. And I think also similar to the worry of if they go down is if they just stay where they are now and they don't continue to grow. That's maybe more of of a thought we're keeping in mind as we think about further budgets.
So Kim Davenport adds, thank you, Victoria. Amazing job sharing information in the clear format and extra high fives for responding to questions from earlier this week. You rock this information. And from Edna too, I will send you the chat, Victoria. I think the other thing I got a message about there's no rate increase. Is this the first time? I would say, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, it varies. I think there have been years that the governor's budget hasn't included any rate increase, and then the House and the Senate, or one branch, includes it. So remember, the end budget is kind of a product of this process of each part of the government putting their priorities out there, and then that conference committee coming together to say, this is what we've got, right? They have a better understanding of where we are revenue wise, and this is how we're going to spend it. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I said in the chat to have more than 100 people go to the early ed briefing with Victoria with Mass Taxpayers, to have 75 people here this morning. It's so encouraging when you think about kind of everybody learning and understanding. It's a lot of information. It can take years to get it, but we can all learn, and just really appreciate, Victoria, how you broke it down. The glossary, the kind of example of a line item in the beginning was so helpful. Please encourage folks to come to the February 12th event. We'll continue to promote it here on the call, but we are kind of subscribing to the dot duplicating but amplify. So we appreciate, Victoria, your incredible information and resource, and then we will have time for more conversation and questions.
Thank you
So,
all. I'll send the slides.
and you'll send the slides, and they'll be in the follow-up materials with everything else for the 9:30 call. We will see everybody on Monday. Program note, the Secretary Tutwiler will join us on Tuesday, February 11th. So we'll stay tuned for the calendar for next week. Thanks, and have a good weekend.
Thank you,
Take care. Thanks,
everybody.
Victoria.